Y en una de esas empecé a consumir.
That's only a half a pill because I did the other half earlier.
He needs to buy the drug. It destroys your life, he says.
The issue of drugs and addiction is a problem across the world. Ireland is no exception. Currently, it is estimated there are approximately 20,000 people addicted to heroin in Ireland. But if we include the misuse of all drugs, polydrug use, then the problem is much greater. Since the 1980s, the drugs crisis has plagued the most disadvantaged communities in Dublin, and in more recent years, it has affected communities countrywide. What is different about Ireland is the unique response we have developed to the issue, a response led by communities and supported by the Citywide Drugs Crisis Campaign. This resulted in the government setting up local and regional drug task forces that are partnerships between the community and voluntary sectors, local authorities and statutory agencies. Drug task forces were set up to develop and implement a drugs strategy for their areas. Representatives from the local authorities, health services, Gardaí, FOSS, social and educational services, public representatives and locally elected community representatives sit on these task forces. Citywide supports, represents and campaigns with communities in Dublin and around the country who live with the reality of the community drugs problem.
Citywide came together in the 90s because it was responding to what was a very dangerous drug problem in the inner city and in other suburb communities. It was set up to actually harness the energy that was there at the time in the streets through the various drug marches and the anger that was on the streets and in communities about the drug deaths, about the increase in heroin, about how nobody seemed to care about what was happening to communities. And Citywide saw an opportunity to harness that energy for good, for a positive interaction with the state, to try and work on getting treatment services and rehab services for their young people in communities. And Citywide saw an opportunity in the era of partnership, as it was at the time, to bring all the main stakeholders together to try and work to actually tackle the problem in a very focused way. Years and years of working on the ground, knowing what it takes, knowing what needs to be done. That's what makes Citywide different, that makes it unique. We want to use that energy and to focus it into positive responses towards the drugs problem.
At the heart of the Irish response to the drugs crisis are community organisations and representatives from around the country. Coupled with these are the specific community-based drugs projects. There are over 100 of these locally based projects countrywide. These projects were often started by local people with nothing more than the belief that something had to be done to turn the tide on the devastating impact of drugs on families and whole communities. Citywide came into existence by the coming together of residents groups, community activists, trade unionists and church leaders. Local communities are now represented by elected community reps on the 25 local and regional drug task forces around the country. Citywide supports the community reps and the community drug projects. Through its staff and networks, it campaigns for and promotes the importance of community in seeking a solution to the drugs crisis.
I think the issue was, for all of us who are working in the areas, that it wasn't just drugs in the sense that it was drugs in areas that were already facing other major social issues. So, for example, all of the original areas that were identified for local drugs task force throughout this country were areas with huge crime rates, huge housing problems, huge educational deficits, early school leaving, etc. So it was drug use and the arrival of a drugs crisis, but in areas that were already massively disadvantaged.
In the early years when I was involved, it would have been mainly heroin. And, you know, the epidemic was there for anybody to see. You could see it very clearly on the streets and everywhere around you, unless you were blind, you know.
I mean, you must realise and understand, we're in our third generation of people with drug problems. Now, I mean, that's high. It's high for an area that was only built in 1948.
It became very visible over the years, you know, through the 90s, that there was a lot of drug dealing happening around the local areas, whether it be housing complexes or flat complexes.
It was around the raves in town, the ecstasy,
using then the heroin to come down off the ecstasy. So that's what led to the growth of the drug problem out here. So it was a certain age group, they'd be all in their early 30s now. And most of them were caught up in the rave scene, the ecstasy and the resultant heroin use. So it really did escalate.
It was a horrible time for people. You had families here, you had women particularly, who, when they found out that their child was doing heroin, were afraid to leave their homes because they instantly believed that if they were going to mass or going to the shops or walking down the street, that all of their neighbours would know about this and they'd all be pointing at them. And we said from day one about this that, look, this could visit anybody.
So very quickly, you know, in the early 90s, there was a bit of a nightmare starting to unfold. But a lot of people in the area didn't realise the problem was as bad. There's a little bit about denial is wonderful, you know, and if it's not hitting my door, I'm okay. But it was for us that was out there in the youth services or other services that was working with a target group of young people, we could see behind the door what was unfolding and the chaos in the families.
There was an awful lot of, at one stage, house burglaries. There was handbag snatching that would take place on the main road. So in many ways, the impact on the family was that they were getting socially isolated because they had somebody that was a drug user in their family.
The drug misuse would be very similar to any teenager's drug misuse. I suppose one of the things that would probably separate lesbian, gay and bisexual and transgender young people, say, from their straight counterparts is they're on the gay scene very young. So because they're outside of belong to, there's not really a safe place where they can hang around in large groups like many young people do in their communities. So they can be young as 14 and 15, going to bars and going to clubs.
Travellers, particularly if they start using heroin, whether that's smoking or injecting it, they would pretty much have to remove themselves from the community altogether, in terms that because of the stigma and shame it would bring upon the family. And in terms that they pretty much then evolve around the city centre, such living homeless, living rough, and using some of the services within the city. Now obviously there's a whole other problem in terms of travellers who present themselves to services and how accessible them services are.
Going back into the early noughties, and at that stage it was very much just cannabis, alcohol, ecstasy probably around about that stage mostly. But the current situation, we say the latest figures in 2009 from the data collection office down here, for the first time ever had showed that heroin had taken cannabis, which is quite significant.
I think Limerick is, you can just go through the estates in Limerick and you can see the devastation that drugs has caused here through the fallout and all the different fallouts, whether it be gang warfare that we've had, which is drugs based. That's simply what it is, like, you know. It's ruined many of our communities, but it's also ruined the image of the whole city.
Different communities are impacted differently, obviously. In some communities it's very obvious that the drugs problem is taking over the community and really wrecking the dynamics of the community, because whole families are caught up in the whole drugs issue, and in particular when heroin takes over.
It's not just heroin. People seem to think it's heroin is a big bad drug. Of course it is, but it's a lot of the families we support, their children or spouses, it would be polydrug use, tablets, upjohns, especially in the Limerick area.
You've all the normal drugs as well, hashish being probably the most common one. You would have some cocaine abuse. Heroin is obviously a very worrying thing, which in certain pockets you will definitely see certain levels of abuse. But I think probably one of the main drugs at the moment that we're trying to combat is alcohol.
Most families come with the awareness of cannabis, and but quite a few discover then that it's not cannabis, it's heroin use. It's any kind of drug, both illegal and prescription drugs, and both the head shop stuff as well. And alcohol would play a major part within that.
And as the problem has grown, so the response has grown with it, and the expertise has grown with it, and I think that's a positive thing. And there have been unique collaborations as part of that. You know, as I said, Citywide pulled the voluntary sector and the other groups together, but they also pulled active drug using groups together as well. Ishka is a representative voice for active drug users, and the Citywide initiated a partnership between them and the Family Support Agency.
So we do a lot of outreach to engage with drug users, find out what issues they have and bring those issues to policymakers, or particularly to the local drugs task force. And I sit on the local drugs task force as a representative of people who use drugs and drug services in the North Inner City. So it's important that that voice gets heard at policy level.
When we decided to develop a service like this, and I think it was around 1995, Citywide was setting up, and we were just blessed because we had obviously Citywide, which was a support system around drugs issues, so we were able to tap into that network.
The community sector has really developed a lot of creative ideas around the drugs issue that I believe the statutory sector would never have developed. Whereas the community sector developed special CE schemes, for example. They adapted it, just took them and adapted it and twisted it and pushed it and shoved it. Now that's an accepted strategy. The special CE schemes are part of drug rehabilitation. And groups like Citywide are essential for supporting those people who get involved.
There's a high prevalence of heroin in Limerick at the moment. Because the drug problem is around Dublin a lot longer, I found that the experience of meeting with people who knew the problem and who had dealt with it for a long time very helpful. By being a member of the task force and by being linked to Citywide would have helped in looking at a response to the drugs problem in Limerick City.
When the task forces started off, that network obviously increased by getting involved with the other community reps and other treatment people, and you build up a wider network, and then you have Citywide, who I believe is the umbrella group for all of these networks.
Well, Citywide's main function is to bring together community activists and community organisations that are working to address the drug problems in their local areas. And we do that so that they won't be isolated in their work, so that lessons that they've learned can be translated to other areas. We do that so that they can feel supported in their work, and also that we can represent the issues that are emerging in their communities to government at a level at which things can actually change for them.
In recent years, government's commitment to the partnership approach has steadily declined. Citywide promotes the partnership model between the community, voluntary and statutory sectors as the most effective and efficient way of dealing with the drugs issue. To fully appreciate the Irish response to the drugs problem and how it has developed to the point it is at today, with its range of services and strong community input, it is important to understand how the drugs crisis evolved from the 1980s onwards and how Citywide emerged as a focal point in representing the community voice in that response.
The very end of the 70s, early 80s was when the drugs problem was really beginning to impact in this area and south inner city as well. When it came to Dublin first, people who were leaders in the community, understandably people just didn't know what they were dealing with.
I would have been a volunteer youth worker back in the 70s and bringing kids on summer projects and things like that. And we would have came across drugs back in the late 70s. I think it was because the Duns were actually importing it around that time. So there was flats on the top of Cashel Road that eventually had to be closed down by Dublin City Council because of the amount of drugs that were being used.
There went from there being, a drink problem and maybe a bit of a hash, but not massive, but drink being big, to a scenario where a lot of people, young people, were using heroin.
Once it did begin to become clear that this was having serious impact on the health of some young people, that it was something that it wasn't just one or two young people that got involved in this. It was beginning to be clear, well now, hang on, there's quite a few young people getting involved. There's one or two who have died. There's one or two who are obviously very unwell. It made sense to people to say, look, the problem is the drug. So the response, I suppose, from community leaders was, well, if the drug is the problem, and if we get rid of it, that'll be the end of the problem.
The guards and the authorities weren't responding to the issue, and communities were badly affected by the drugs and crime at that time.
The general trust of the concerned parents were the group of people and the campaign that was focusing on what the issues were, which was the massive social harm caused by drug dealing and drug taking of heroin in those areas, and the state's inadequate response. They were the issues, and the government, I think, made a fundamental mistake of not trying to co-opt or get in partnership with the majority of people who are involved in the concerned parents. I think that might have been a possibility. That's what happened later on in the 90s.
So it was about the political priorities at the time. The drug problem, they now knew there was a drug problem in the north of the city. It wasn't a political priority. And it was overtaken by other political priorities, and as a result of that, a huge amount of effort went into effectively, I suppose, smashing the concerned parents.
There was a particular ideological approach to drugs as well, which was pretty much, why don't those people stop taking drugs, and when they're ready to be drug free, they can come back and we'll look at treating them then. And that was the kind of state response to drugs. And what was available in terms of drug treatment was if you were lucky, was a quick 2-week detoxification, and that was it.
There wasn't a needle exchange in Ireland back in the late 70s, so people were actually using the same syringes, and a lot of those people that had shared syringes actually did develop HIV.
You had also the HIV and AIDS, which again was a terrible disaster to happen because people weren't aware of it as they were in later years, and the whole issue of shared needles, people didn't really understand the huge danger they were putting themselves in. So there were many young people, sadly, who may have been only experimenting a few times even with heroin, ended up getting infected, and many of them died, as well as the ones who were using it a lot and so forth. So it was a real human tragedy.
Sometimes people say, well, it came in the 80s and then it went away and came back, and of course it didn't go away at all. I mean, after the mid-1980s, it went out of, I suppose, the public consciousness. It was no longer an issue. It had been a big issue. The very visible dealing in the south inner city ended, the Duns and people like that. There was action against people who were seen as some of the major dealers, and there was this sense, well, maybe that problem's been dealt with.
Obviously the amount of money being made, and it meant that inevitably it was going to move to other areas. So therefore it moved to Ballymun, Crumlin, lots of other areas.
It was spreading quietly from the north inner city out then. I mean, it was going into, and it was there very early in the sort of nearer suburbs, Crumlins, Ballyfermots, but then spreading further out into the newer suburbs, the Tallaght, Clondalk and Blanchardstown.
Some of the key campaigns in the 80s was to stop the destruction of inner city communities. Now the irony of that is that lots of those people who were shifted out without any social supports, without any real thinking out of what were the consequences of destroying these communities, that they still retain the links with their massive extended families. So once the problem began in the inner city, it wouldn't take long before it spread out.
But all that was kind of, it was like it was seeping out quietly. But bit by bit, I suppose, as it was coming into the early 90s, in particular communities, that was beginning to become a crisis in those areas in the way it had in the inner city.
A community drug problem is when it begins to impact on the networks, the everyday lives, people going about their business. So when it begins to affect people doing their shopping, their bus service, for example, when people stop going out at night time because they're afraid. So it's more about the impact of the drug use rather than drugs themselves or the numbers. And in some communities that impacts more than others.
When people were taken to the streets again, they were focusing, there was meetings in the old McCushla Hall, they had 800 people at them, and they were about naming drug users, they were about marching on drug users' houses, all of that stuff was going on again. But I suppose at the first meeting when everyone came together, there was a recognition we did that 10 years ago.
I think the community started to get a bit older, that suddenly it was their children that were dying as well, that were dying from overdose or were being infected with HIV and AIDS. And it was slowly dawning on people, look at that, this isn't, there's no quick fix here, this is, an entrenched problem that, requires a bit more thought.
All across the city in different areas, people were saying, we can't manage this anymore. And ICON then, which was here in the north inner city, they said, let's bring everyone together. Let's just call a meeting and bring everyone together.
First meeting we looked for was the use of Liberty Hall, and again, to get to Liberty Hall you had to go through the trade unions. The trade unions were very receptive because many of their ordinary trade union members in all these areas without Dublin would have raised with the union that this is an issue.
What we tried to do was bring as many people into the process as possible. We called a meeting in Liberty Hall. We created an alliance with the trade union movement, which was very important to us. We also created an alliance with the church. We set up the Citywide Drugs Crisis Campaign. Now we were still campaigning, doing marches and stuff like that, and local communities were doing whatever they could, but we were trying to get a situation where the seriousness of this problem would be at last be recognised.
We said we need to have our very clear policies around what it is we're looking for. And that sort of brought the groups together around, not just about protest and street activity, it brought them together around, right, well, what kind of policies do we want?
It was a serious organisation. This wasn't an organisation of people who were just with a political agenda. They had one agenda, and that was the community agenda, and making sure that the community voice was heard in respect of drug treatment.
You also had that some of the drug dealers had become so powerful that they were taking on the state quite openly. And so, for example, Veronica Guerin. But here you had them feeling so powerful that they could take on such a high-profile figure as her and murder her.
This had now become a political priority. It wasn't in the 80s, but it was in the 90s. Main reason being, unfortunately, because Veronica Guerin had been killed. That made it a political priority for the broader society.
You had the murder of Veronica Guerin, and you had more and more emphasis on supply-side measures, on criminal law measures, on the setting up of the Criminal Assets Bureau. And I think that Princess Rasa and myself are very adamant that we couldn't deal with the problem by criminal law measures alone.
This drugs problem, there's health aspects, we need health services, there's education aspects, we need, more, people need to be more aware of what's going on. There's obviously huge policing elements in it. So they said clearly we need an interagency response. You need all these people around the table. No one agency can deal with the drugs issue. So I suppose that was a huge difference to the 80s.
We came to the conclusion that the missing connection was the community. That while you had a situation where the health board claimed to know best, or the Gardaí claimed to know best, the problem was getting worse. So we came up with this pretty unique model that was essentially based on a partnership between the community and the statutory agencies.
Well, the way the task forces were actually set up was a good idea. I think groups that knew what was happening on the ground, they were the ones that were encouraged to put in proposals to the local drugs task force, and they'd send it up to the national drug strategy. And it was fairly straightforward at that stage.
Most of us just said we will go in and evolve this as we see it needing to evolve, but based on it said, well, look, we recognise, the most important thing that we can do is get treatments widespread across Tallaght, so that you could deliver the drug services on the ground, whether it was in education, prevention, supply reduction, estate management, whatever you needed to do, that the resources would be there for it. As I said, it was almost like a revolution because we were dealing with decision makers.
That was extraordinary for people. Now, this is actually a genuine attempt at engaging communities, and it was at that stage. There was a real commitment to making sure that the community involvement was real. I think it was an acknowledgement in some way by, if you like, the political establishment that we did get this wrong.
In all of the key areas where Citywide had got its representation from throughout Dublin, Tallaght, Ballymun, Dunleary, Rathdown, the poor areas of there, Crumlin, the canal communities, North Inner City, South Inner City, Dinglas, Darndale, all the key areas where there'd been a massive drugs problem, all were now set up with local drugs task forces that had all the local players on. As time went by, everything began to get more bureaucratic. In the early days, the rabbit report is a little slapsticky thing, but action happened on it. Later on, you have lovely glossy reports, but far less action.
That the drugs task forces were focused on areas of need, particularly in Dublin, Bray, Cork, and then of course the regional task forces were rolled out in 2000. So as the problem moved outside Dublin, we tried to extend the solutions. And again, Citywide was central to that, supporting the community voice, making sure that the community was central at all stages. We'd always argue, if the community ain't at the table, there ain't a solution.
Citywide promotes a community development approach to the drugs problem. This means involving the people who are most affected by the problem, drug users, their families, and communities. There are a broad range of community responses to the drugs problem, including treatment, rehabilitation, harm reduction, family support, education and prevention. Many local drug projects run special CE schemes. These vital initiatives give hope of a better future to 1,000 participants trying to rebuild their lives.
I come from a long history of drug addiction and I went into detox, got myself drug free, went on to further treatment and a drug free day programme.
Community based things do really work because It's a year ago now today that I'm clean, a year ago. And when I first came to when I first started becoming clean, I was down and out, like, basically. And I got a lot of support off the girls here, Siobhan and Kelly and all the girls. I got a lot of support when I came here, and new lease of life.
I'm an ex-heroin addict, well, a recovering heroin addict. I always had an interest in music and writing. I'd done a lot of writing, but I never had an outlet really.
I came down on the CE scheme with a view to accessing training and going to college and building up my skill set in order to work in the field of addiction.
When I started kind of getting into recovery, a lot of my key workers kind of suggested RAID for me, said it would suit me.
I've recently had the opportunity to do an interview, and I've been taken on full-time here now, assistant CE supervisor with a key working capacity.
When I found out a bit more, I really wanted to join, so I just went for the interview and I just phoned and eventually I got it.
Thousands and thousands and thousands of people in Ireland and elsewhere have been heroin users and are not, and they've gotten on and moved on in their life. Why? Because they found something to connect with, they found something to belong to.
A decision myself and my friend made in Mountjoy. We decided, and we worked our asses off when we got out, to get into one of these places. We've tried Coolock everywhere, all the way down till we got took on here.
We work with adults over 18 in recovery and in active addiction, so we have a drop-in, we have a prescribing methadone clinic which we work with. We key work people, we have a CE scheme, we have a cocaine response, an aftercare group, a stabilisation group, so we have a whole gamut of services for anyone in recovery or in active addiction.
This project, I would say, saved my life basically, because I was just going worse.
The educational side of it is great because, you know, you get back into the education, and for me, I found it brought back a lot of my self-confidence. I would have been quite isolated before I started here, where years ago communities would have been a lot closer with drug abuse and that. It would have fractured communities, and this is a way of bringing communities back together again, you know, and finding trust in people again, and not just being isolated, realising that there are people with the same problem as you.
The drug services is vitally important when they're based in local communities, because they know what the emerging trend is, they know what the issues are. Local people see that they're coming in and out, they're seeing them progressing. That's important.
Certainly here in the South East, we are embedded in our local communities. We are respected in our local communities. The feedback that we're getting through our workers' network are saying that we are meeting the issues that are on the ground there. We are working with parents, we are working with people in recovery, we are working with people that want to come into recovery.
I think there's real value for money in terms of the spend here in Ballyfermot Star and other drugs projects around Dublin, in fact around the country, because what it does is it supports family life. The objective of all these programs is to get people back into mainstream life. If you put prevention money into programs like ours, you're not going to have the crime levels are reduced, you're not going to have the same chaos. So people will be able to live their lives in their own community without causing problems to this community and to other communities as well.
Well, there's no doubt that communities are far better off than they were in the 90s. Almost every community that has a drug problem has responses in place. They have services in place that they didn't have before. Well, special fast CE projects are absolutely critical. They underpin the work that goes on in many local communities. They offer at any one time 1,000 places for people who want to address their drug use and are in rehabilitation. Well, you cannot solve the problem without involving the community. It's madness to think you can. The community are the experts. They need to be at the table. We need to be sitting around the table together, and Citywide provides that vehicle.
In the 15 years since Citywide was established, the community drugs sector has made an important contribution to dealing with the many and often complex consequences of the drugs problem. The community drugs sector provides vital services in the state's response to the issue and has been able to adapt to changing drug misuse patterns. What began as a heroin problem developed to include cocaine, the misuse of prescription drugs, head shop drugs, street mephedrone, and the much wider availability of alcohol to almost every corner shop and garage in the country. The drug problem today can be more accurately described as one of poly-drug use in an environment of violent criminality and intimidation. While a great deal has been achieved by the community drug sector, there are also important challenges that need to be confronted. The declining commitment of our government to the partnership approach needs to be addressed.
An organisation like Citywide, it's always trying to bridge that gap between what's happening on the ground and the policy makers, because that's the problem with this country. The policy has been made, the decisions have been made by people who live on a different planet.
What happened us 20 and 25 years ago happened because they did not liaise with the community, that they didn't listen to community. They hadn't got a clue to what the problems that drugs and alcohol brought to our areas and what we were suffering and what our families were suffering.
The big one coming up for me will be how we as a society address alcohol, because so far, despite a clutter of reports, etc., we have failed to take action on the recommendations that are needed to effectively combat the problems associated with alcohol, which are massive and much bigger in facing all the communities, not just the poor communities, but every community, than the illicit drugs trade.
The only thing that actually moved really fast was the head shop stuff. And I think it was because it affected all classes, or all classes saw it as affecting them. Whereas the drugs issue is kind of pocketed to disadvantage, and it is a completely unrealistic view to have. The other thing is recognising that the drugs issue is not heroin. The drugs issue is every single drug that people take to fix their lives.
We all are about the same thing, you know. We do want to improve standards for people, you know what I mean, to have access to treatment for people. Because that's really where it's at. It is about lobbying for better treatment services and more coherent and positive responses to drugs.
We've been good at getting people help. We've been good at getting them help quicker. And I'm not just talking about community sector here, I'm talking about the inter-agency approach. But young people are still getting into problems. Certain communities are still experiencing big problems.
Because if Citywide weren't there, I think a lot of drugs organisations would be working in isolation, and if you're working in isolation, well, how does that benefit the community as a whole? Where if we're all working together and we're all aware of each other's services and we're aware of what's happening within the community, well then we're much better at tackling the issues that are in the community.
Since the introduction of the new strategy in 2009, there has been an erosion of the structures that underpin the strategy. The community have felt more isolated, have felt more under attack. Its structures and supports have been effectively dismantled. Cutbacks have savaged the services. So there are challenges, but what Citywide wants to do and needs to do is to give a new impetus to this partnership drive. It has national networks behind it. It has people in those national networks that have a massive range of experience, and it still has extremely committed people who want to work in partnership, who want to resolve this problem for their communities.